Major General Kenneth Nava serves as the Adjutant General for the state of New Mexico. In that position, he serves as the senior military advisor to the governor and is responsible for providing the state of New Mexico and the United States with a ready force of citizen airmen and soldiers. General Nava's career began in 1988, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant through the Officer Candidate School in 1992. He has had various staff positions at the battalion, brigade, and joint force headquarters. He has education degrees from the University of New Mexico, a Bachelor of Arts in University Studies, and in 2013, he received a Master of Strategic Studies from the United States Army War College in the Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. For a more personal insight to the Adjutant General, he's been married for 26 years to his wife Dawn. They have 3 children, Alicia, Aaron, and Ariana, excuse me. And he now is the proud grandfather of 2 grandsons, Zachary and Elijah. Thank you so much, Major General Kenneth Nava, for coming today and sharing with us the legacy of the Bataan in World War II.
Very good. Yep. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And I talked to the ladies up front. I hope you didn't eat a big lunch so you don't get sleepy during this lecture. First of all, I would like, again, to thank you for the opportunity to come spend some time with you this afternoon. I do offer General Baca's personal regrets that he was unable to be here. He had a family member that had taken ill, and he and his wife Rita had to travel unexpectedly. He had been planning on this for quite some time. Ernestina and Francis had set this up for a long time. So he offers his deepest regrets that he couldn't be here today with you. Before I get started on the talk, could I please have any veterans in the room raise your hand? Okay. And then family members of veterans, please raise your hands. Okay. I would like to thank you all very much. We're getting ready for Veterans Day, and this is the time of the year that our nation remembers those that have served in the service of our nation. And so I would like to thank you all very much for your service, for the family members as well, because it's a two-part thing. We can't do what we do without our family support, so I would like to recognize all of you. So, I'm going to tell the story how this all worked. So General Baca calls me on Wednesday, and he says, Ken, I need a favor. Now, I've known General Baca for a very long time. I'll tell you a little bit about him and my family's history. But, sure, sir, what do you need? I need you to speak. Okay, sir, no problem. When? Saturday. Saturday. What's the topic, sir? Bataan. Okay, that's good. I can talk about Bataan. And he says, Kenny, there's nobody better to talk about Bataan than you. I want you to do this talk. Yes, sir. I got it. So it's in Taos at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Got it. Who's the point of contact? Francis and Ernestina. Oh, okay, great. So now I'm thinking, I really got myself into something. So let's find out. I'm briefing the Historical Society of Taos on history. And so I'll tell you right up front, I am not a historian, but I am a soldier of almost 30 years, and I'm a student of history. And so as I go through this, I'm going to kind of give you some of the insight that I've learned about this event that had such a huge impact on all of New Mexico. And I know I have family members of Bataan veterans in here, Mr. Bonds over there, for example. If there's something that I say that's inaccurate, start flapping your arm. Because one of the things that I want to make sure that we do, that we continue to do, is remember the true story. Remember the history as it was. Not changing, not modifying, but remember it as it was. And so that's very important to me. Chief, you go to the next slide, please. This is the agenda we're going to follow, or mostly follow. I want to talk about the background. I'm going to kind of set the stage a little bit because that's important when we talk about this. I'll talk about the events in the Philippines. I had the advantage, the great pleasure of being in the Philippines in 2008. And so I'm going to share some photos that I took while I was there in the Philippines. I also was the public affairs officer for the New Mexico National Guard at the time, so I took audio clips of what I saw, and those are embedded in the presentation. So you're going to hear, it's scratchy, it's not edited, but it is, when I was in the Philippines, what I was reading, or what the Filipinos that were with me were saying, and so we'll go through some of those as I hit some of those pictures. I have 3 stories that I'm going to describe of heroism displayed by soldiers during their time. And there are countless stories. There's probably hundreds of thousands of these stories, but I'm going to tell you about 3 of them. We'll talk a little bit about their liberation and what all of us in New Mexico observed after that. And then I'll briefly talk about the New Mexico National Guard today and why this is so important to me as the Adjutant General. All right, Chief, if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we have to go back just a little bit to 1898 when we have the Spanish-American War. And we have Teddy Roosevelt basically knowing that he needs to go get some soldiers. He had spent time out west, and so he came to New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and he was looking for people that could ride horses, that could shoot, and that could follow instructions. And he knew he would find them here. He found many of them here in New Mexico, and they helped form the 2nd Squadron, 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. They were with Teddy Roosevelt when he went up San Juan Hill. There's some great paintings and prints of this, and it's the New Mexico National Guard, the volunteer militia, with Teddy Roosevelt. He was godfather to many of these folks. He would come to the reunions here in Las Vegas, New Mexico for the longest time. So we have this starting of horses and service to the nation in a very, very admirable and recognized way. Today, the New Mexico National Guard, we are the only unit in the Army that carries this battle streamer carried during the Spanish-American War at San Juan Hill. We have that on our flag. We carry that on our flag. There's no other unit in the Army that carries that flag. Other than the Army as a whole, the Army as a whole will carry that battle streamer, but there's no units other than the New Mexico National Guard that carries that. Okay, so we'll fast forward a little bit past, we're going to fast forward to Pancho Villa. Okay, so what Teddy Roosevelt did with the National Guard was nothing short of amazing. But he had to short circuit the system to make it work. So he basically manipulated the system to get them the horses and equipment that they needed. He manipulated the system to get them to the front of the line so they could get to Cuba, because otherwise they would have been way back in the rear with the gear. They wouldn't have gotten there. He had to manipulate the system to make it work. What happened at the national level after this is Congress said, okay, this model of the militia, it's kind of working, but not really. And so in 1903, there was an act called the Dick Act that was passed. And basically what it said is, we, Congress, are going to give you, states, money for ready troops. Your National Guard, your militias, must be ready when we call them for a national emergency. They must be ready. So we're going to give you money, but in exchange you give us readiness. That's what you give us. The first test of that was in 1916, when Pancho Villa came across the border in Columbus, New Mexico, and we basically had a raid there. The active duty contingent that was there was overwhelmed. The first people to their rescue were New Mexico National Guardsmen from Deming, New Mexico. Those New Mexico National Guardsmen broke into their armory. They didn't have access to it. They broke into it, got the weapons, and went to Columbus. And so they were the first ones there to help them out. The National Guard, as a whole, the entire nation was mobilized to provide security along the southwest border in 1916. Over 100,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. The first were right here in New Mexico. Right here in New Mexico. So it was kind of a proof of concept. Congress gave the states this money in exchange for readiness. They called them en masse, 100,000 of them plus, and they provided security along the southwest border. While General Pershing went into Mexico to do the punitive expedition. Of course, General Pershing never found Pancho Villa, but it was a test run. It was a test run for the expeditionary forces that would be called later for World War I. So people like General Pershing, obviously, who was the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in World War I, George Patton, who was a lieutenant, driving around in armored cars at this time, eventually would become a great tank commander. Right? So this was the proving grounds for World War I. New Mexico National Guard was there. All right, so,
Douglas MacArthur.
yeah, that's right. That's right,
Later in the
eventually here.
Philippines.
That's absolutely correct. Okay, so in 1921, after World War I had completed, again, the New Mexico National Guard had a field artillery battery there that fired more rounds. You can check your facts on this. This was Alpha Battery of the 146th Field Artillery Regiment. It fired more rounds than any other unit in the Army. More rounds. They had countless numbers of Silver Star recipients, Bronze Star recipients, Purple Heart recipients. It was an incredibly well-decorated unit. Mostly Roswell, New Mexico kind of claims this unit, although they were from all over the state. In 1921, after World War I, the New Mexico National Guard was completely reorganized. We had the 111th Cavalry Regiment, horses. We're out west, people love their horses. We had a cavalry unit that was outstanding. We had engineers, and we had that field artillery battery was still around. In 1939, the War Department suggested that the 111th should convert to another branch of service. Now, how that happened exactly, I've heard that the officers had a chance to provide input. Maybe Mr. Bonds can provide some insight into that. That they had an opportunity to provide input into what type of unit they were going to be. But nonetheless, they were selected to be Coast Artillery. Okay, so horses make a lot of sense in New Mexico. How about Coast Artillery? Yeah, not too much. So
Protect the Rio Grande.
yeah, protect the Rio Grande. So we talk about the leadership that was in at this time. So me, as the Adjutant General, we think about what kind of a salesman would the Adjutant General at that time had to have been to tell these guys, this is a good idea, we're going to be Coast Artillery, right? So it was, but nonetheless, they accepted the challenge and they said, okay, we're going to be the best field artillery unit, or Coast Artillery unit that we can be. All right, so we have, in 1940, we have the 200th Coast Artillery, the 158th Field Artillery, the 104th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which would later become the 804 Tank Destroyer Battalion, and the 120th Engineer Regiment. These are all the units of the New Mexico National Guard at the very, very beginnings, right before the United States entered into World War II. If you'll flip this slide there, Chief. Okay, so by February of 1941, all of the New Mexico National Guard had been activated, everybody. And what the party line was, you're going to go spend a year on active duty, and then you'll come home. That's what they were told. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the 200th Coast Artillery in particular, but that's what everybody was told, okay? So they're down at Fort Bliss, and they're being the typical New Mexicans that we are. They worked very hard, but they played very hard. And there was a lot of times that they got themselves into a little bit of trouble. That's okay, though. That's New Mexico. That's even today. The New Mexico National Guard, we still do that. First sergeant used to have to chase soldiers all around, making sure that they didn't get into too much trouble. The 200th Coast Artillery did a really fine job down at Fort Bliss. They did all their training. Now, some of the training they had to basically make believe a little bit. And to be honest, this is no different than us today. So when I came in as a private, I used to have to pretend to use a minesweeper, and then we would use a mop or a broom, and that's what we would pretend would be the minesweeper, because we didn't have the minesweeper. These soldiers had to do similar things. Yeah, they basically didn't have all the gear that they needed. They didn't have all the equipment that they needed. They had World War I era uniforms, World War I era rifles. They didn't have all the things that they needed in order to prepare themselves. But it was no big deal because they were only going to be mobilized for a year. That's what everybody thought. Towards the end of 1941, they had a competition to see which units could meet all the standards. So the Army has standards when it comes to marksmanship and things of this nature. Well, our guys did outstanding. They outshot everybody. They were deemed the best unit in the Army. And for this, they were rewarded with a mission. They were going to go somewhere. They didn't know exactly where. Okay, so they were basically going to find themselves going to the Philippines. Their time there, when I talked to some of them, and again, Mr. Bonds at the end, he's going to tell some stories about his dad and some of the other men that were with him. But the stories, as I understand it, is when they first got there to the Philippines, it was pretty fun. I've seen pictures. We have a photo album in our museum that I would like to invite all of you to come see at some point. But we have photos before the 8th of December. And they look like they were having a grand old time. They're out there. You could see them with little senoritas. They're having a great time. It looked like it was fun. It looked like they were having a good time. So they would train, but just like other New Mexicans, they would have fun when they had their off time. Okay, so on the 8th of December, just hours after Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, these folks who are defending Clark Field are attacked. And that very first image, at the very first one I had in the background, that was an image of Clark Field. So the New Mexico National Guard, they were the first to fire on the Japanese from the Philippines, the first to fire. The branch that I had in the Army for most of my career was an air defense artilleryman. The branch of the air defense artillery in the Army is first to fire. That comes from the New Mexico National Guard. And that's the motto to this day. Okay, so as they are firing on the Japanese, and some of this is firsthand from my good friend Ernest Montoya. Ernest passed away last July at the ripe young age of 97 years old. So Ernest tells me that, look, the problem that we had was not that we had poor equipment in the Philippines. They had state-of-the-art, basically the earliest radar type equipment, searchlights. These were all tied together, very, very high tech, but they never trained with them until they got into the Philippines. So they're doing OJT right there. The ammunition that they had would not reach the altitudes that the Japanese were flying at. So they could not reach them. It's not that they couldn't have shot them if they were at the right altitude, but the ammunition that they had was old and was the wrong stuff and would not reach the altitude that the Japanese were flying at. Basically, the Japanese did to us, the United States and the Army in the Far East, what we do to everybody else these days. They destroyed all of our aircraft on the ground. Most of them did not get up into the air. And so they did to us what we do to everybody else these days. The first battle-born unit in the United States Army in World War II, the first unit that was created out of nothing, was the 515th Coast Artillery. And it was created from the 200th Coast Artillery. So this is another claim to fame that we have in New Mexico. The first battle-born regiment in World War II was the 515th Coast Artillery. They sent some of those folks from the 200th to Manila to defend Manila. And again, in Manila, they had all kinds of equipment there that needed to be uncrated, set up, because we were unprepared for the attack that happened on the 8th. That's also where the food was for the withdrawal into Bataan. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. All right. Go ahead and just stay on that sheet right there, Chief. Okay. There was a plan. It's called War Plan Orange. So basically, the Army does this. We come up with different plans for different types of contingencies. So in the Philippines, they had several different plans. This one plan, War Plan Orange, was the plan to withdraw onto Bataan. So General Hama in the 14th Army, by the 23rd, so we started on the 8th, by the 23rd of December, they had aerial superiority, which means they could fly with no problem at all. There's no chance anybody's going to shoot them down. They had aerial superiority, they had naval superiority, which means there's no chance anybody's going to stop any of their ships from moving in or out or anywhere around, except for in Manila Bay. They had naval superiority. And so this Orange Plan, this War Plan Orange, was to withdraw into Bataan. It was a very complex plan, but very well thought out, very well thought out. When it comes to the actual execution, though, it wasn't very well executed. So the biggest problem that occurred here into this withdrawal, so the plan was, we're going to just slow down the Japanese as they move down into the Bataan Peninsula. And we're going to keep everybody out of the Manila Bay. So Manila, that was kind of the golden prize. Manila, the Bay of Manila, is the finest natural bay that provides protection for ships anywhere in that theater. So that was the prize. It's protected by Corregidor, which is an island, a rock island. I'll show some pictures of that here. It's protected by Corregidor, but that was the prize, to keep Manila Bay safe. And so the plan, the Orange Plan, War Plan Orange, was to withdraw into Bataan and slow down the Japanese for 6 months. For 6 months. That's how long the plan was supposed to take. And in that 6-month period of time, everybody, the rest of the nation should be coming to our aid. That was the way the plan worked. The biggest issue with the war plan, if you think about the time frame from December to April 9th or to May 6th for Corregidor, they were right on their timeline when it comes to 6 months. They were right there. The problem is they did this without any food. The food was left in Manila. So that's what the logistical plan was. They were supposed to have logistical trains going up and down 6 different sectors in the Bataan Peninsula but the food was in Manila. The food was left in Manila. Okay, so these other things we're going to talk about, the death march, Corregidor, the hell ships, the prison camps. I'm going to talk about this. I have a video that I wanted to show. I'm not going to be able to show it today because the volume is just not clear enough. It is an interview that my son, who is now 23, attending law school at Arizona State University, and my youngest daughter, who is now 17, as a junior in Rio Rancho High School, Ariana, and I did with Ernest. We did it in 2008. And it's a wonderful interview. It's not edited also, but it's got my son asking Ernest questions. And he asked him questions about what it was like in Corregidor as being a young 20-year-old man there on Corregidor, what it was like during the withdrawal into Bataan, what it was like being crammed with 22,000 other people onto a hell ship, what it was like going to Formosa and being a prisoner of war for 3.5 years. So my son's asking him these questions, and he's being just totally open with them. So it's an incredible little interview. I'll make sure that Ernestina has it. I'm going to post it on my Facebook tonight after I get it in the right format and with the volume where people can hear him talk, because he's speaking very quietly. But so just real quick on the death march, not all the New Mexicans that served in the Philippines did the death march. Okay, Ernest was one of those that did not do the death march. Why is that? Well, when it came time that General King surrendered on April 9th of 1942, some of them went over to Corregidor. And they got in little bonka boats and they went to Corregidor, and they fought for another month. They fought until the 6th of May when they were surrendered. They did small marches, like 20 miles, but they did not do the 65-mile brutal death march that the other people suffered. So some of them didn't do that. Again, my son's video, he's asking him these questions. The hell ships, they're called hell ships for a reason. And it's really one of those things it's very sad. The Japanese, I believe, they had no intention of doing what they did. But they did because of the circumstances that occurred. So just like our logistical plan didn't work for War Plan Orange, they expected when they took over the Philippines that they would have 15,000 captives. 15,000. Not 75,000 that they did have. They expected that they would be able to put those prisoners on trucks and truck them out of the Bataan Peninsula. Well, that simply did not happen. And so, again, their code, their ideas about surrender and what people who surrender, what they should be treated like, led to the most brutal type conditions that these men could undergo. There's another gentleman that lives in Albuquerque right now. His name is Altolano David. He's an author. He's a wonderful sculptor. He's a veteran. He was a Filipino. And he's currently 97 years old. And he's doing awesome stuff. He just published a book, Altolano David. When I talked to him about the death march, because he did do the death march, he just describes this horrible, horrible treatment that they went through. Fortunately, he escaped halfway through the death march. He was one of the lucky ones that was able to escape. Okay, we're going to talk about the rest of the stuff next. Go ahead, Go Chief. Okay, Mount Sama. These are pictures from the Philippines that I took in 2008. So Mount Sama, you can see, like, it's very difficult to see, but there's a cross there. There's a cross at the top of that mountain. That mountain was key terrain. So in the military, we identify key terrain as terrain that allows you to control the other terrain around it. Mount Sama was that key terrain. And that was a critical location during the battle in Bataan, through the withdrawal into the Bataan Peninsula. The image to the right is a picture of me and some other soldiers and Filipinos in 2008. And this is at the base of Mount Sama. It's a beautiful, huge memorial. And behind us is a plaque. You can see the New Mexico Zia. There's a plaque there memorializing the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery. Now, when I saw it, I wasn't too happy about the condition it was in. It was pretty much in poor repair. And so one of my missions here with our museum at some point is to go send a team over there to either fundraise and fix that thing up, or figure out how we can keep it updated. But it was an incredible visit. I had the opportunity with some other soldiers and Filipinos to trace the entire Bataan Death March. We went all the way down the Bataan Peninsula, and then we went back up the Bataan Peninsula through the order. So go ahead, Chief, one more slide. Okay, this is in Mariveles. This is where the death march started, mostly. Okay, obviously it started wherever you were, that's where you started, but the furthest point on the Bataan Peninsula is Mariveles. And so you have to excuse the scratchiness of the audio, but go ahead and click down again. So the death march of Filipino and American prisoners of war from Mariveles and back, how do we say that word right there? Bagak. To Camp O'Donnell, Capas, Tarlac. April 1942. Immediately after the fall of Bataan, on April 9, 1942, U.S. Filipino forces were evacuated by the Japanese from the field of battle as prisoners of war. The more than 70,000 Filipino and American troops who had survived the Battle of Bataan underwent in this evacuation the ordeal that history now knows as the Death March. The Death March started from 2 points in Bataan, on April 10th from Mariveles and April 11th from Bagak. The Filipino and American troops were marched day and night under blistering sun or cold night sky, staggering through Cabin. How do we say that next one? Limay, Orion, Pilar, and Balanga, where they were given a brief rest and some water. From Balanga, the prisoners of war were organized into groups of 100 to 200, and under guard marched on through Abucay, Sama, and Orani, where the Americans were segregated from Filipino prisoners of war. They marched separately. The march continued northward through Hermosa to Layak Junction, thence eastward into Pampanga, through Lubao, Guagua. That was the first one, right? Lubao, Guagua, where the prisoners were arrested and given little food at the National Development Company compound. Bacolor, and San Fernando. Already suffering from battle fatigue, the Filipino and American troops were strained to utter exhaustion by this long march on foot. Many were ill, most were feverish, but none might rest, for the enemy was brutal with those who lagged behind. Thousands fell along the way. Townspeople on the roadside risked their lives by slipping food and drink to the death marchers as they stumbled by. In San Fernando, the death march became a death ride by cargo train, where the prisoners were packed so densely into boxcars that many of them perished from suffocation. Those who arrived alive in Capas had still to walk the last and most agonizing miles of the death march, the 6 kilometers to Camp O'Donnell, which was to become one of the most hellish of the concentration camps in World War II.
That is the Adamic translations.
Yes. Okay, so the guys that are helping me, Fernando Los Bañez, he was a major at the time. He is the public affairs officer for the 7th Infantry Division from the Philippines. He was helping me with the words and whatnot. I'll tell you about the Filipinos. They are the most incredible people ever. It's like being home. It's like being here in New Mexico. They're very hospitable. They'll take care of you. They'll give you the shirt off their back. They're incredible people. So they're helping us go through this, and they understand the significance of what it meant to us as New Mexico National Guard to trace this Bataan Death March. They knew what it meant to us, and they made it a very special experience. Go ahead, next slide, Chief. Okay, these photos, these aren't my photos. The photo on the very left is General King surrendering on April 9th. And as a general officer, you think about what it would take to get a person to do that. He's surrendering 75,000 Americans and Filipinos. This is the worst day, really, when you think about U.S. military history. And so, but he did this out of compassion. This was the thesis, when you watch the video of my son interviewing Ernest, the thesis was he had to make this decision. He had to make this decision to save his men. And Ernest ultimately said it was a compassionate decision that he made. It was a difficult decision for him to make. The soldiers that were there, they did not want to give up. They did not want to give up. And what they were told is, listen, you are not surrendering. I, General King, am surrendering you. I don't want to see you all perish. But they were not ready to give up. The images, the one in the center shows the Japanese. So unfortunately for us, for history's sake, there's not a lot of photographs left. Obviously none of us were with smartphones popping camera and taking pictures. If they were found with a camera, it was death. There are a few pictures. but many of them come from Japanese war correspondence and not from United States sources. And then the image on the right, we see these are commonly used pictures to show the death march. I will tell you this, I was in the Philippines in February, so it was February of 2008, and it was incredibly hot, incredibly muggy. We slept in nets so that we didn't get disease from the mosquitoes. We took medicine so that we wouldn't get malaria. Well, go back 70 years, 65 years at the time. What these men were having to deal with for months of not eating or eating quarter rations. They ate everything. They ate the horses, they ate the carabao, they ate the rats, they ate everything that they could get their hands on. And so at the end of this, they were on very limited rations because the food was in Manila. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, the boxcars that were referred to in San Fernando, that's one of those boxcars. When I saw that boxcar, it almost brought me to tears. To think about 100 people crammed in that little car. It's made of wood, it's got corrugated steel on the top, and can you imagine that in 100 degrees in that kind of a climate? 100 people crammed into it. They kept each other up. People would pass away standing up, and when they emptied out, that person would fall. It was a horrible, horrible thing. On the right is the mile marker 16. And so, Chief, if you'll hit the down arrow.
Okay, so we're at kilometer 16 of the down march.
16, and what is written there is that the 5-month siege by the Japanese on the Filipino-American forces on the Second World War ended in one of the houses on this site. When General Jonathan Wainwright of the USFS surrendered to General Homa of the Japanese forces. So it actually, the siege by the Japanese on the US Filipino forces ended on this site, in one of the houses on this site.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we did as we went, so there's a book called Beyond Courage by Dorothy Cave. Incredible book. We tried to follow her book to try to trace things out. And unfortunately, when we went to places like Cab Cabin, the airstrip that was at Cab Cabin, I wanted to see that. It's no longer there. The jungle has claimed a lot of these places. Some of them have been driven over, by just society, population. They've taken these things over. So the house that they're referring to, where the surrender occurred here at kilometer 16, we couldn't find it, but we looked. And but it's all. It was an incredible experience to go through this journey. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Chief. Okay, at Camp O'Donnell, we weren't actually at Camp O'Donnell, but we were at a place called Capas, which was close to where Camp O'Donnell is. Camp O'Donnell is still used by the Filipinos to this day. It's used as a training facility for them. So the things that we would have expected to see are not there. But they have a national shrine, they have a national memorial at Capas. And so we have here on the right-hand side is the cross that was erected at Camp O'Donnell. So the story here, we have a photograph of the original cross in our museum. One of the gentlemen that was on the team that built that cross was from the New Mexico National Guard, from the 200th Coast Artillery. His great-grandnephew brought me the picture of that picture. So the Japanese were not horrible in that they showed a little bit of compassion, but it was kind of twisted compassion. They gave these prisoners in Camp O'Donnell a bag of cement so that they could make a memorial to their dead, to their war dead. They surely did not expect a Christian cross to be made. So these men did it anyway. And they made a cross, and they erected it to memorialize their war dead, to spite the Japanese. And of course, they got beat horribly for that. But it was their deal. They gave them a bag of cement to make the cross, and they did. Let's go ahead and click down, Chief.
Capas Prisoner of War Memorial, World War II gravesite of United States Air Force, as you were, United States Armed Forces Far East POWs. On these hallowed grounds, thousands of U.S. Armed Forces Far East, Filipino and American prisoners of war, held captives in 1942 and 1943, died of disease, starvation, and neglect. Their remains were unceremoniously dumped and buried in hastily dug common graves within this area. wrapped in tattered blankets and slung on bamboo poles. Their living comrades carried them to their graves in a procession of the dead from dawn to dusk. Available historical records indicate that out of approximately 54,000 prisoners of war incarcerated within the Capas POW camp, a total of 25,000 Filipino and 2,500 American servicemen were buried in these common graves. In 1946, the United States and Philippine Armed Forces grave registration units started moving the remains of the buried dead to the United States Military Cemetery and the AFP Limangan Nagmay Bayani Cemetery in Fort Bonifacio, Makati, Metro Manila, where their mortal remains finally were laid to rest in peace. This memorial stands as an indelible reminder that the freedom and liberty can only be won when we, the living, are willing to offer our lives and make the supreme sacrifice to the honor and glory of our country.
Quick, one more time, down, Chief.
This memorial is dedicated to the brave men and women.
Down again. Yeah, same thing. All right, this is on Corregidor. This is on Corregidor. So again, we went all the way to Corregidor, jumped back to Mariveles, and we traced the Bataan Death March. So kind of out of sequence with the rest of it, that's why I put the Corregidor pictures here. This is the Malenta Tunnel. This is where General MacArthur had his headquarters. A very impressive tunnel network. So there's one main tunnel, and then they have laterals going off the sides where they had hospitals, administrative buildings, they had all kinds of different areas. It's ventilated. It provides great protection from mortars and indirect fire. Corregidor is beautiful. It's just like the paradise that you would expect it to be. It's beautiful. When you look at images of what Corregidor looked like in 1942, it looked like the moon. It looked like the moon. As I discussed with Ernest, so he turned 20 years old in April. So he spent his first year as a 20-year-old on Corregidor. And he said it was nonstop shelling all day long for 30 days. For 30 days. And the Japanese, what they were trying to do is they needed the port, they needed the Bay of Manila. So they were trying to get Corregidor. That was the last piece they had to take care of. I don't have any images of what it looked like, but I would suggest go find an image of what Corregidor looked like in 1942 after the shelling. And it looks like the moon. There's no foliage at all. The trees are, they're little toothpicks standing up. It doesn't look anything like it did when I visited. Go to the next slide, Chief. This is Battery Way. These are some of our gun positions that were there. These are things that the United States built in the late 1890s to help defend the Philippines when it was one of our territories. And so these are things that we built. You can go through, and as you walk through there, you can see the pock marks from the bullets, from the shrapnel, from the rounds that were there. We were able to tour the hospital. All these buildings they're barely standing up. There's hardly anything left of them, barely standing up. But you get a very clear image of what it must have looked like in 1942. Go to the next slide, Chief. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit. We have about 15 minutes left of the hour. I want to talk a little bit about three individuals. And the first is Jose Quintero. Jose was not a New Mexico National Guardsman. Okay, so he's always referred to, he's an incredible story, but he was not a New Mexico National Guardsman. He was born in Texas, moved to Albuquerque when he was a young man, so he claims himself he's a New Mexican, but he was not part of our 200th Coast Artillery. He was of Mexican descent. He was born in Mexico, or he was born in Texas, but his parents were Mexican. He didn't even know what the flag was all about. He didn't know what the flag stood for, what the 13 stripes were for. He didn't know how many stars were on it, didn't know any of that. But he knew that he loved his country and that he wanted to honor this country. So he basically scrounged materials to build a United States flag while he was in captivity in the Philippines. He began to scrounge material in the form of a red blanket, white bed sheets, and he stole these from the Japanese. The blue background came from Filipino dungarees. And there was a Canadian soldier that helped him. This gentleman was a double amputee, but he was working in the tailor shop. So these two conspired together and they made a flag. Now, if you've seen General Baca speak, he has that flag. He has the flag. And eventually it will land up in the Smithsonian. So he didn't know any of the story, though. He had to ask the other prisoners there, what's the deal with the number of stars? tell me about the stripes. What does that mean? What does the colors mean? What does the red mean? What does the white mean? What does the blue mean? So he's learning about this, but nonetheless, he's taking his personal risk. Not just to him, though, because the way the Japanese worked is, if Chief Hiron is doing something wrong, there's 9 more of you that I'm going to punish when I punish him. So one person does something wrong, but 10 will be punished. So he's endangering himself not only, but also these other folks. The staff that he put it on was made out of bamboo, which is what the Japanese used to beat them with. The tassels were added later, after. They weren't there when he was there. From parachute cord, from the parachutes used to drop supplies on the camps after the war. So the flag took him over a year to complete. He kept it wrapped in a piece of canvas and buried in the dirt under his bunk. Pretty risky if you ask me. So at the end of the war, close to the end of the war, when you had American bombers flying over and they saw a facility that looked like that, they wouldn't know that it was a prisoner of war camp. They would have no idea. He took that flag out and he waved it when these bombers are passing by. And the bomber would tip its wings and said, okay, we know there's Americans there. He saved everybody in that camp with that flag that he risked his life to build. Again, General Baca has that flag, so when you do have an opportunity for him to come back and speak, Ernestino, you got to make sure he brings the flag, because it's incredible. All right, if you could go to the next slide, Chief. Chaplain Ted Howden. I did have a picture of him. I lost it, but it is out there on the internet. Go Google this guy, Ted Howden. He was an Episcopal priest. He was a chaplain in the 200th Coast Artillery. When the war broke out, he was a captain, and he was a chaplain in the 200th Coast Artillery when it was federalized and sent to the Philippines. He would walk around and hold open-air services for the prisoners, and they would call him Chappie. That's what they call him. That's what we call our chaplains to this day. We call him Chappie. He was a real soldier as well as a chaplain, and he gained the admiration and respect of everybody as he moved from battery to battery holding services. And he would distribute candy, soap, cigarettes, whatever he was able to forage for the troops. He was a spiritual presence to his men, and in him they saw demonstrated love, goodness of life, and joy in serving others in the Lord's name and for his sake. So after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, he and his fellow soldiers were made prisoners of war and forced to endure the Bataan Death March. He did do the Bataan Death March. During imprisonments in several prison camps, including Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan, he finally made his way down to Davao. So this is one of those things that I learned later. I thought about the prisoners that were on Luzon. I knew about the prisoners like Ernest that were in Formosa or went to Japan, went these other places. But I didn't realize that the Japanese kept prisoners down in Mindanao. And what they were doing was growing food for the Japanese army. They were farming down there, and that was part of their supply logistics. This is where Chaplain Howden was. He was down in Davao. His heroism and faith was always apparent through the humanitarian care that he gave to those he served. At great cost, he gave his own portion of food and medicine to others that needed it more than he. He died of dysentery and starvation-induced issues on December 11th of 1942. But his family unfortunately didn't know about this until June of 1943. He was buried by his men in a small cemetery in the shadow of the Mindanao jungle, a mile or so from the camp in Davao. After the war in 1948, his remains were reinterred in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I can tell you, I attend a ceremony every year in honor of Chaplain Howden. And they are seeking that in the Episcopal Church that he be canonized, to be made a saint. He is it's really incredible when you talk about all the individual stories of sacrifice and things that he did. Very incredible. If you go to the next slide. Evans Garcia. Here's an image of Evans with his daughter, Margaret. Mr. Bond, you probably know Margaret well. So Evans Garcia, he passed away about 5 years ago. An incredible man. The one little snapshot story I'll tell you about him is that he never got sick. He never took any medicine at all. He never got sick at all. You talk to his daughter. His daughter, Margaret, wrote a book called Tell Me Another War Story. It's an incredible little quick read, but it's the story she heard from her father when her father was collaborating or talking with the other Bataan veterans. And so it's an incredible book. But he never got sick. Evans was the guy that was always stealing food, stealing medicine, stealing whatever he could to help his peers. Well, he got caught. He got caught by a guy that they called Donald Duck. So again, The soldiers are going to make fun of the Japanese. They're going to do what they can to keep fighting. Even though they're in the worst kind of conditions, they're going to continue fighting. This is what we're taught to do. And that's what they were doing. So Donald Duck caught him and was very upset with him. And you remember the 1 to 10 ratio about the beatings that would happen. So, but they told Evans, tell us who you're giving the stuff to, what's going on, tell us what's going on here, and we'll spare you. And he said no. And he said no, and he said no, and he said no. And they put him in front of a firing squad, and he used a lot of profanity, and he told them, no, I'm not telling you anything. Well, Donald Duck was trained in the United States. He spoke very fluent English. He was no problem at all. Well, they beat Evans within an inch of his life. They beat him horribly. They beat him horribly and left him there to die. But he didn't die. He didn't die. He had that spirit, that will to live, to continue to live. And he never told who was part of his little ring. And he probably resumed the ring as soon as he was well enough to do it again. There are so many stories about things like this. And these are just a couple of them. And they're from folks that I have been working with. Next slide. So at the end of the war, we have the United States come back, or the New Mexico National Guard come back. About 800 and 900 of the soldiers, the original 1,800, actually came home. Many of them died. People like Ernest Montoya. Ernest spent a year at William Beaumont. He spent a year there. They're trying to make him better. They finally said, Ernest, go home. We can't help you anymore. We cannot help you. Go home. Go home and die. But he didn't die. His mom and his wife and his baby daughter, they nursed him back to health. And he lived to the ripe old age of, not ripe young age, I'm going to say young, of 97. He was incredible. He was an incredible man. So many of these folks that came back, they led incredible lives, they did incredible things, and they are pillars upon which New Mexico is built. So New Mexico had a population of about 500,000 in 1941. 1,800 New Mexicans went in the 200 Coast Artillery. About another 1,000 New Mexicans went to serve in the 120th Engineers and the 804 Tank Destroyer Battalion. So we had a smattering of people from across the entire state that were represented in this war. Per capita, we had an incredible number of people serving in the war effort. That's just New Mexico National Guard, not counting all the other services. And so the impact of the Bataan Death March that the incident in the Philippines had upon New Mexico was incredible. So some of the things that we see that are still visible today, and I'll show a couple more pictures of some of these survivors, are the monuments that existed all over the country. Individual communities put up monuments, like the monument that's here in Taos, like the park that is in Albuquerque, like the bridge that is in there. New Mexico did this all over the state. We wanted to remember our soldiers that were in this conflict. And so every community did their part. Every community did everything. And it's so to the very much the detail. When you go to Roswell, New Mexico, or to Carlsbad, New Mexico, the number of bulbs, the number of tulips that they planted there, representing the numbers from their county that were killed. There's so much detail, so much thought, so much wonderful things that went into it. And so part of what I would advocate for is that we continue to keep these monuments and these markers and these parks alive so that we can't forget these folks. So these folks all came back with them. Next slide, Chief. Mr. Saavedra, he's one of those people that came back. But he kind of went off the radar. He wanted nothing to do with the National Guard, with the military, anything. He just wanted to put this behind him. So there were many of those folks that came back, they wanted nothing to do with it. They wouldn't speak about it. They didn't talk with other veterans. Mr. Saavedra was one of those. This is a picture of General Montoya, Mr. Malin Love, our civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, Mr. Saavedra seated, his son standing behind him, and Sardo Sanchez behind Mr. Love there. We went to go give him his medals. He never received his medals. And his son, the family reached out to us and said, we'd like to get his medals. We got him. We flew into Grants. He lived in Fruitland, New Mexico. We flew into Grants in a helicopter, and we were escorted by a police, by a fire engine. We made this big production out of it. You can't really tell unless you look very closely, but he is so mad at us. He is mad. He told General Montoya, get those damn medals out of here. I don't want them. He was mad at us. And so, because we were bringing up things in his life that he had just put in a little compartment. He didn't want them. So we gave them to his son. I attended his funeral a couple years ago, and I was chuckling with his son. You remember when your dad was ready to throw us out of your yard? And they was laughing about it. But some of them, that's the way it was. Next slide. Governor Reyna. This is a picture of us taking him. This is just prior to his 100th birthday. We're taking him a picture of him and Governor Martinez. That's General Baca on the right and Mr. Loudermilk, Jeff Loudermilk on the left. So we went to his house. He was one of those people that had a smile on his face all the time. All the time. I have a video, again, if I had more time I would have prepared this, but I'm going to provide some of these videos to Ernestina. I have a video of when they were liberated in Mukden. So Tony was one of the ones with Ernest Montoya in Mukden. And obviously he's very tall, and you can pick him out in a second. This is black and white, no sound, no nothing, but they're scanning across the people there. And you can see Tony Reyna. He has a necklace on, he has something, and he's tall, and you can pick him out in a second. It's awesome. It's one of those things. But he's got that same smile that I always saw him. Didn't matter how his health was, he always was smiling. And what an incredible. So this is another group of our veterans who were like him. Went out, twice governor. I think he was twice governor, right? So he went out and he did all kinds of incredible things for this community, for the New Mexico National Guard. He was always there for us in any of our events. Just an incredible man. Next slide. Jack Aldridge and Harold Heiss. So Jack Aldridge was the spouse of Dorothy Cave Aldridge. So Dorothy Cave, the author of our book, Beyond Courage. He's on the left in the white shirt with the bow tie. On the right is a gentleman by the name of Harold Heiss. This is my battalion in 2003 in Roswell. I was the executive officer of that battalion. They too would come and they would visit with the soldiers. They'd drink coffee with us. They would tell us stories. And it was incredibly important for us to keep their memory alive. And so I have these pictures. And behind them is our battalion colors with the presidential unit citations, the 3 presidential unit citations, and the Philippine unit citation that these gentlemen earned. Next slide. Ernest Montoya, again my friend, my very dear friend, here on the right-hand side in the front. Next to him is William Overmeyer, and this is me. Ann is the little lady in the back. So Bill and Ann are still alive. They're in Albuquerque, and Bill's getting a little more grumpy as he moves along, but Ann keeps him in check. And they're very active with the Bataan Corregidor Memorial Foundation in Albuquerque. Just incredible men. So Bill was a construction manager. Many of the housing developments in Albuquerque and the North Valley, he built them. He and his sons had an incredibly successful construction company. Ernest worked for the IRS for 20-some years as an accountant. To the day he was probably, I'll say 96, he was still trading stocks every day himself. He would get online, he would get on the computer, and he was doing his own transactions. He had an iPhone, he had an Android phone, he used digital cameras. This gentleman totally embraced technology. He was incredible. Incredible. Next slide. Okay, so I want to transition real quickly to the New Mexico National Guard. This is me in Iraq as a battalion commander in 2009. And I'm cutting a cake because we had just commemorated the Bataan Death March. I did a mini Bataan Death March to commemorate this in Camp Buca. This is where I was at. And on the right-hand side, you see we called it T-wall art. So those big concrete things, we would use them to protect us from indirect fire. So when the bad guys were shooting mortars at us, those would provide some protection for us. But soldiers being soldiers, we had to decorate them. And so what we did on this, in our T-wall art, is I have the commonly seen photo of the 3 soldiers, one with the doughboy helmet to represent those folks that were in Bataan. The one on the right is wearing current day field gear. So you'll see him with a pack and with the helmet that we use these days. And so I have the Bataan soldiers are carrying our soldiers of today. On the very top it says from Bataan to Baghdad to Mosul. So the battalion I commanded was born of the 515th Coast Artillery from Bataan. And then it was served in Baghdad in 2003, and then it served in Mosul with me in 2009. So I carry that lineage, me personally. The New Mexico National Guard carries it as well. Next slide. Okay, so I hope you found what I've shown you interesting. Hopefully, I didn't see Mr. Bonzo there waving too much, so hopefully not too inaccurate. But thank you for letting me come speak with you. Thank you for continuing this, because again, history is very important to us. Accurate history, the real history is important to us. And I would ask you to help me to always remember our Bataan survivors, the veterans, those that served, their families, and all those that served in New Mexico. Again, for this day, Veterans Day, coming up on November 11th, thank you to all the veterans that have served and to all the families. Mr. Bonds, did you have a couple of stories? You had some funny stories you wanted to share.
Yes, I was knee-high to a duck right after the war, and many of the ex-POWs would come and visit at the house, and I'd be told to go to bed and close the door, but I'd leave it open and I would listen. And there was some humor of what they said. But first of all, I'd like to just mention that General, I think Matsururi, the Japanese general that commanded the Japanese forces coming down into the Philippines, his goal was to hit and go on down to Australia. And the Philippines, as in military, the general will go along with this, you don't leave your rear to where you can get attacked. So they had to clear the Philippines before they moved on down to Australia. And he was really mad that this small amount of men kept him from moving right on. And so the men called themselves no mama, no papa, we're the battling bastards of the Philippines. The 515, the battery that my dad commanded, if you kept your guns firing, the Japs couldn't come down low, because strafing down low, they could do a tremendous amount of damage. They got down low. So their goal was to keep the Japs up high. Okay, their battery was credited with knocking down the first Japanese zero of the war. Now, on the lighter side, as they fell back, and to delay the Japanese from coming on. Now remember, the Japs overwhelmed them in manpower, and of course they didn't have a lot of food, supplies, or ammunition. The ammunition was from World War I. 1 out of 4 or 5 shells would fire. And as they came back one evening, my dad had set up his battery there. This chieftain from one of the villages came up and said, it would be a real honor for you to come and have supper with us. And my dad thought, well, you know, that ought to be nice. He says, I'll be with you in a few minutes, and he checked on things. So he went with the chieftain, walked into the village, and here were these tables with a lot of food. And then there was this dog on the table. And, you know, that kind of startled him, but he said later on he would have eaten the dog. But my dad was quick on his reply, and he said, I'm a vegetarian, and I can't eat meat. So then he went back up to join his men. And about 2 or 3 days, as they fell back, another chieftain came and asked if he would join. He says, I can't tonight, but my first sergeant can go with you. And the first sergeant, you know, they were hungry. This was food. So he goes with him. And sure enough, on the table was the dog. And after, I don't know if he ate any or not, but afterwards, the sergeant came up and he says, "Captain, did you know there was going to be a dog on the table?" My dad didn't answer him. He outranked him. And he said, "Captain, answer me. Did you know there was a dog on the table?" And my dad said, he just kind of didn't say anything. And then the sergeant said, "Captain, don't you ever appoint me again to go to the village to one of those suppers." And then one of the other stories that there was, I can't think of his name right offhand, he was a West Pointer that came up, and he was talking about they had come in off of one of the work details, and they would sit down and play bridge. And he said they're playing cards, and I got this brilliant idea. He said, "Why don't we build a Hilton hotel here so that we can all come and commiserate, talk about the camp?" No reply. So I thought, well, maybe they just didn't hear me. Once again, why don't we build a Hilton hotel here so we can all come and talk? He said with that, they grabbed him, threw him out the window, and he fell in front of a Japanese guard with a rifle and the bayonet. And he figured he was dead. He said the Jap guard looked down at him, looked up at the window, looked back down on him, stepped over him, started laughing about it, and he said, "You know, I never brought that up again." Thank you.
Were there going to be any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, once the Japanese separated the American POWs from the Filipinos, what was the treatment of both camps? Were they more hard, if that's not the right word, on the Filipinos than they were the Americans, or vice versa?
No, I think they were as hard on both of them. So again, their mindset, the Japanese mindset was these people surrendered. So they didn't care. You could have been any color, any size, anything. They didn't care. They surrendered. And so they were less than a dog. They were less than, they didn't really care about any of them. The Filipinos, when you think about the numbers of them, so quite a few perished because there was more of them. It's just that there was more of them. I think they were all equally treated just as horribly. And it's one of these very, very sad things. You think about one human treating another as poorly as they did, as brutally as they did. The stories are very, very difficult to fathom. I can imagine for a family member reading these stories or hearing these things, just incredibly brutal. But I don't think there's any distinction. I think they treated everybody just equally as bad. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You kept mentioning this fellow named Ernest Montoya. There was two other Montoyas from Cañon, Horacio and Ben. Is Ernest their brother?
No relation.
You know about Horacio and Ben. There were
So
two
which one was the
Montoyas.
one that lived in California? Ben. Okay, so I've met Ben before. But no, none of them were related. They weren't related
Ben
to
and
Ernest.
Horacio were
Yeah, they
brothers.
weren't related to Ernest.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought, because you know about the Ben and Horacio story, and Horacio wrote his son wrote a book on his experiences with the Bataan Death March. And he
Which
just
I
died.
think,
Pardon?
he just died, yes.
Yeah.
So it's incredible for the family members, just like Margaret's story that she just wrote on her father. Really important to try to capture as much of this as we possibly can. So, yeah, but there was no relation. Ernest did have siblings. He had a brother
Just wondered.
that served in the Marine Corps.
Because they had a brother named Ernest.
Oh, did they?
Horacio and Ben,
Yeah.
My aunts were married. I have two aunts, Romalda and Loyola Torres, and they were married to Ben and Horacio, who came back from the war, and they lived a block away from each other in Albuquerque.
Wow.
And they just both recently died recently.
Ernest,
Anyway, I was just
Ernest
wondering.
lived in San Jose on the south part of Albuquerque. His dad was the benefactor that gave the land and helped build the San Jose church that's down there. He was a farmer and a grocer down in the South Valley area. Just really an incredible story. And I was honored. My grandfather died in 2002. My grandfather was a paratrooper in World War II. He jumped in the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment on D-Day. He jumped into Holland in September of 1944. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was a hero. He was a great guy. Well, I lost my grandfather in 2002, and that's about the time that I met up with Ernest and with Bill Overmeyer. And the only reason that I did this is because I had leadership like General Baca, who taught younger officers as we were coming up. These guys are treasures. They're so important to take care of them and know them and learn their stories, learn the things that happen to them so we don't let them happen to us. Right? So we talk about using World War I ammunition. Do you think General Novel will let that happen to my soldiers? No way. Do I think I'll let them use, Vietnam era uniforms and stuff? No way. They're going to have the best of the best. I'm going to make sure of it because of the lessons that we learned from these soldiers in Bataan. Yes, sir.
There were some people from El Paso who were involved in that. Were they part of the New Mexico National Guard because of?
There were. So again, in El Paso, that's where Fort Bliss is located. That's where we mobilized. Not all of the 200th Coast Artillery were organic from New Mexico. When they got to Fort Bliss, they received fillers. They received personnel from all over the country, actually. They came in to get their ranks up to what they needed to be. So there are people that are in the 200th Coast Artillery. The Bataan Corregidor Foundation in New Mexico has a wonderful roster of all of the folks that served. If they died, where they died, if they survived, where their next home of record was. It's a beautiful database that they have. But yes, there were people from all over the country actually, and there were some from El Paso that were fillers that came into the 200th Coast Artillery.
Is that electronic? Is that on the computer?
I would go to their website. So Bataan Corregidor Foundation of New Mexico. So BCFONN.org. Hit that website, and you can do research on individuals from the 200th Coast Artillery off their website. Any other questions? Well, I would like to close before Ernestina throws me off here. When you get an opportunity, please come visit our museum in Santa Fe, 1050 Old Pecos Trail. We're the only museum that doesn't charge admission. It's only open between certain hours, so check the website to make sure that you got the hours right. I'd hate for you to drive from Taos down there and not be able to get in. But go visit. And we have a great part of our collection is dedicated to remembering those that served in the Philippines, those that served on Bataan and Corregidor. We have some wonderful artifacts there. If you like history, which you must if you're here and you listen to me, please come by and visit our museum.